Sometimes trouble can come in the strangest of forms. It's not always recognizable. It doesn't always look like trouble. Sometimes it looks like the polite, well-dressed man who checked into the hotel president in Kansas City on January 2nd, 1935, carrying no luggage. The man asked specifically for a room several floors up on the inside with a view of the hotel courtyard rather than the street below. The hotel was able to accommodate him and gave him a registry to sign. He pinned his name, Roland T. Owen, from Los Angeles, and was given room 1046. Randolph Probst, who worked as a bellhop for the hotel, accompanied Owen to his room and showed him around. On the way, Owen made small talk, speaking of his stay the previous evening at the Mulebach Hotel and his displeasure at the high rate they charged him. When Probst and Owen arrived at their destination, the room was exactly as requested, being several floors up and overlooking the courtyard. While Probst was with him, Owen removed from his pockets what was presumed to be the entirety of his personal possessions that he carried with him: a hairbrush, a comb, and toothpaste. After Owen had placed his items above the sink, he and Probst left the room. Probst locked it, as it could only be locked and unlocked from the outside, handed him the key, and Owen went on his way. A little while later, Probst saw him exit the hotel room. Not long after Probst saw him exit, Mary Soptic, a hotel maid, went to his room to clean it. She was surprised to find him there, sitting in the dark, with only one small, dim lamp turned on, and the shades drawn. She felt uneasy once she saw that he was there. Owen told her to go ahead and clean. At some point during her routine, he got up, brushed his hair, slipped on his overcoat, and left, asking her to leave the door unlocked, as he would be expecting visitors shortly. She did as he requested, leaving the door unlocked. At 4 p.m., Mary returned to room 1046 with fresh towels. When she opened the door, she saw Owens laying on the bed, fully dressed. Plainly visible from the hallway was a handwritten note on the table which read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." She dropped the towels off and left, feeling very uneasy about this guest in room 1046. The following was a new day. The hotel welcomed new guests and tended to ones who were already there, even the ones who made them uneasy. Mary Soptic returned to work for her morning shift. She went along the rooms for the morning cleaning service and reached Owen's room at around 10:30. She knocked on the door, hoping he wasn't in there. There was no answer, so she tried the door, locked. It appeared fortune was on her side, since these doors could only be locked or unlocked from the outside. That meant he must be out. She slipped her key out of her pocket, unlocked the door, and went in. Roland was sitting in the dark in the same place he had occupied the previous evening. She looked at him for a moment, trying not to show that she was slightly unnerved. He told her once again to go about cleaning. She did as he said and began to change the sheets. The phone rang while she was working and Owen picked it up. He listened for a moment before saying, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast." "No, I'm not hungry." While he was still on the phone, he began conversing with Mary while she cleaned. He asked her about the hotel, whether or not it was residential. He also was very curious about whether or not she was responsible for cleaning the entire floor. The conversation finished with Owen once again reiterating that the mule box rates were robbery. He seemed to be stuck on that fact. At that point, Mary was finished and left. He was a nice enough fellow, but he was a little off. Mary left, but she returned to the room with fresh towels at 4. As she approached the door, she heard 2 men talking inside. She knocked, and a man with a deep voice responded, asking who was there. "I have fresh towels for you," she said. "We don't need any," replied the man with the deep voice. Whoever owned that voice, it was not Owen. She had spoken to him on a few occasions and knew that his voice was always lighter. One thing was for sure, though. She had taken the towels that went to this room this morning. The room had none. The man's statement was false. What was going on here? 2 hours after this, Gene Owen, a resident of Lee's Summit, Missouri, a suburb of Kansas City, had checked into the hotel after becoming sick while shopping. She was given room 1048 near Owen's room. Later that night, the police were called due to noise complaints, and she would tell them that she heard men walking up and down the hall talking very loudly and profanely. She wasn't the only one who reported this either. Robert Blotcher, the hotel elevator operator, confirmed her story. Blotcher, as it turned out, was fairly busy that night. His shift began at midnight, and according to his report, people didn't settle down until at least 1:30. He'd taken a mysterious woman to 2 different floors that night for most of that hour-and-a-half period. The staff assumed she was soliciting business, and Blotcher agreed. At one point, she apparently had a few appointments on the 10th floor, and she made a comment to Blotcher that her client in room 1046 was not there. She expressed confusion since he had called her specifically and he had always been there on her previous visits. Whether any of this is related to the case, we don't know for certain. In fact, one man seems to be certain that he saw Owen during this time period at a different place. At 11 p.m., Robert Lane was driving along 13th Street near Lydia Avenue and was surprised to see a young man wearing only an undershirt, pants, and shoes run in front of his car and flag him down. Lane stopped his car, at which point the young man said, "I'm sorry, I thought you were a taxi." "That's all right. Can I give you a lift to get a taxi?" "I'd appreciate it, thank you." The young man got into his car and Lane drove. "You look like you've been in it bad," Lane told him. He could see a deep scratch on the young man's arm, and he noticed that he was cupping his other arm, presumably to stop bleeding. "I'll kill someone else tomorrow," he said. Lane thought he meant that he had been beaten up and was going to retaliate. They arrived at 12th and Troost, where taxi drivers would wait for fares during the night, and he let the young man out. "Thanks," he said. He got out and honked the horn of a taxi parked nearby, and Lane went on his way. January 4th sprung into life the same way as all other days. People went back to their jobs at the hotel president, and Robert Blotcher went home after sharing stories about the crazy night during his shift. More strangeness involving the guest in room 1046 was always welcome gossip. He briefly exchanged pleasantries on his way out the door with the new switchboard operator Della Ferguson, who came in for her shift at 7 a.m. Della saw that there was a note requesting a wake-up call for room 1046, and she was preparing to make the call when she saw that there was a light on, indicating that Owen's phone was off the hook. She couldn't make the call that way. Randolph Probst, who had originally shown Owen to his room, was once again on duty. He was sent up to deal with it. When he arrived, he noticed a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging on the door. He knocked. No response. He knocked again. Nothing. After a few more tries, a voice from inside the room said, "Come in." Randall could not because the door was locked somehow from the outside. He knocked again, and the person inside said, "Turn on the lights." "The door's locked, sir. Please hang up your phone," he said, and went back to work. When Probst returned to the switchboard operator, he told her what had happened and suggested that she wait until 8:30 to try again. The guest in the room, as far as he could tell, was drunk. Ferguson obliged and waited until 8:30, but the situation hadn't changed. The phone was still off the hook. So another bellhop, Harold Pike, was sent to his room. The door still sported the "Do Not Disturb" sign from earlier, untouched in the last hour. He knocked on the door several times, but unlike Probst, Pike's knocks received no reply. He opened the door with the key he carried. Owens was lying on his bed in the dark, disrobed. Apparently, Probst had been correct in his assessment that the man was drunk. This was more than Pike cared to see. He went ahead with the task to which he had been assigned, and went over to the phone which was dangling on the floor and replaced it on the receiver. At this point, he noticed some dark spots on the bed, but didn't think anything of it at the time. Task completed, unnoticed by Owen, he exited the room. It seemed like the task was over and done with. Except that it wasn't. At 10:30 a.m., Ferguson noticed once again that the phone was off the hook in room 1046, and sent a bellhop again. Probst, once again, got the assignment. This time he had learned his lesson and took a key. He would regret that decision momentarily. When he reached the door, the same "Do Not Disturb" sign remained hanging on the handle. He knocked several times, knowing the drill by now. And just as he knew the drill, he also knew nobody would answer. And he was correct. Probst pulled the key out of his pocket and opened the door, expecting to find Owen drunk and laying on the bed the same way that Pike had. But that was not the case. Instead, he found Owen on his hands and knees 2 feet away from the door. He had a head wound and was bleeding profoundly. Probst placed the phone back on the hook and turned on the lights, revealing that there was a massive amount of blood in the bathroom, on the walls of the main room, and on the bed he had been laying on. The bellhop was shocked by this and ran downstairs to get help. The assistant manager heard his account and hurried to the room to help Owen, but they couldn't even open the door more than 6 inches as he had fallen in front of it. Eventually, Owen was able to move himself and sat on the edge of the bathtub, while Probst stayed with him and the assistant manager called the police. The police arrived with Dr. Harold Flanders of Kansas City General Hospital for an examination. Owen had been tied with a cord around his neck, wrists, and ankles. Bruising along his neck indicated without a doubt that someone had been trying to strangle him. But the same person had also bashed him in the head with a blunt object, fracturing his skull, and stabbed him several times in the area of his heart. In fact, one of his lungs had been punctured by his wounds. Flanders used a knife to cut the cord binding Owens, giving him what little relief he could be offered at this point. "Who did this to you?" asked the doctor. Owens weakly said, "Nobody." The doctor was confused. If that's true, what caused these injuries? "I fell and hit my head on the bathtub." The doctor asked if he was trying to harm himself. He said, "No." And then he lost consciousness. When he arrived at the hospital, he was comatose. He lived in that state until midnight the following evening, and then he died. The Kansas City Police Department began their investigation immediately, and they started with the account of the guest who had complained 2 nights prior, and unfortunately for her, shared the same last name. Jean Owen was brought in for questioning. She had been very close to Owen's room after all, and it sounded a little strange to their ears that she checked into a hotel when she became sick rather than returning home. Lee Summit is less than 30 minutes from Kansas City, after all. But she had been visited by her boyfriend that night, and he corroborated her story. She was then released and no longer considered a person of interest in the case. While the police were looking for clues, an autopsy was performed, and Owens was determined to have died as a result of his wounds, making this officially a murder. Dr. Flanders made a trip around the room looking for more evidence to add to his report. He knew that Owen had been witnessed on 2 occasions by 2 employees of the hotel during that day, but the fact that the bloodstains were dried by the time he had arrived indicated to him that the wounds had been inflicted sometime between 4 and 5 a.m. that morning. Pike had missed these wounds simply because he hadn't turned on the light, although he did report that he had seen some dark spots on the bed. A search of the room turned up no personal belongings of Owens. The hotel staff reported that he had brought nothing with him except the hairbrush, comb, and toothpaste which were in his pockets. Those items were now gone. All that was left was the tag from his necktie. Above and beyond that, the soap, shampoo, and towels provided by the hotel were also missing. Whoever had done this had taken off with everything. No knives were found in the room, nothing that would have given him the injuries he suffered. Some extra items that belonged to neither Owen nor the hotel were found, however. A hairpin, a safety pin, an unsmoked cigarette, and a full bottle of sulfuric acid were all found in the room. Owen hadn't brought anything in with him, and it was unclear to whom these items belonged. Of particular note, however, was the discovery of 4 fingerprints. These prints were small, likely belonging to a female. they didn't match to Owen or to any of the employees working at the hotel. This was baffling. Nobody had seen anyone enter or leave his room. Who could have done this? The next day, the police released the story to the press to look for help from the public. This was clearly a murder. The police took a look at the registry and saw that Owen was from Los Angeles. This might be very helpful. The LAPD were called for help, and a description was given of Owen. But it didn't take long to discover that there was nobody in Los Angeles by that name. It had likely been an alias. At this point, the fingerprints were turned over to the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, because this was getting to be beyond the scope of the Kansas City Police Department. The police asked the newspapers to report that Roland T. Owen was likely an alias and to ask for help from anyone who knew who this man might be. Calls came in to both the hotel and to the police department giving tips and saying he could be a person that the caller knew, but none of these panned out. In hopes of gaining new information, the body of Owen was laid out in the local funeral home for people to see in an attempt to jog someone's memory. One person whose memory was jogged was Kansas City local Robert Lane. He reported that he had given Owen a lift a few nights before to find a taxi. The police, however, were doubtful that this encounter was with Owen because nobody had seen him leave or return to the hotel that evening. In fact, there was only one corroborated sighting of him outside of the hotel, and it placed him at several alcohol stores on 12th Street in the company of two unidentified women. Well, there were fingerprints likely left by a woman, weren't there? But who they were or if the prints even belonged to these two at all is unknown. Wire services picked up the story and sent it all over the country, with newspapers in all parts running it. It was requested that information and photos be sent to the Kansas City Police Department. As a result of this, they spent an enormous amount of time and manpower in trying to correspond with police departments around the country by both phone and mail. Many leads were eliminated. After the investigation was underway, Randolph Probst remembered the conversation he had had with Owen when they had first met and he had shown him to his room. He remembered Owen's complaint that he had checked out of the Mulebach Hotel because the prices were robbery. Police looked into the lead and found that nobody by the name of Owens had checked in there. They did, however, have a record of a man matching his description going by the name Eugene K. Scott from Los Angeles. He also had the same requests for his room reservation, a room on the inside overlooking the courtyard rather than the street. Knowing what they would find but needing to eliminate the lead anyway, they called the LAPD to find that Eugene K. Scott was also not a resident of Los Angeles. The body was identified a few different times as cousins, clients, friends, and so forth, but these never ended up being accurate identifications, and the coverage and investigations dwindled out of sight as other homicides took precedence. Owen, or whatever his name really was to be buried in the city's Potter's Field on March 4th. As with everything else in this case, the funeral couldn't even occur without something odd happening. On March 3rd, the funeral home received a mysterious call from a man who requested that the funeral be delayed. He wanted to send them money for a grave and a service at Memorial Park Cemetery in Kansas City, Kansas. He wanted the man to be buried near his sister. The director let the man know that he would have to tell the police about this call, but the caller was unconcerned with that. "Why was Roland T. Owens killed?" asked the funeral director. "What happened?" The caller gave him a very straightforward answer. "He was involved with one woman while being engaged to another," he said. "Myself and those two ladies set up a meeting with him. Cheaters always get what's coming to them," he said, and hung up. On March 23rd, the funeral home received a carefully stenciled envelope containing $25 that was carefully wrapped in a newspaper. It covered the entire costs of the funeral. The sender was never identified. 13 roses were delivered for the funeral after the local florist had received a similar call, and 2 envelopes containing $5, along with a card that read, "Love Forever, Louise." Both calls had been made from payphones. Police officers and detectives were the only people to attend his funeral, some of them even serving as pallbearers. Several days after the funeral, another mysterious call was received by the Kansas City Journal. This time it was a woman who complained that they had misreported that Owen was buried in a pauper's grave, when he had in reality been given a formal funeral. When asked who she was, she replied, "Never mind, I know what I'm talking about." The representative from the Journal pressed her for more information, and she simply said, "He got into a jam," and hung up. In Birmingham, Alabama, a woman picked up a copy of the American Weekly and sat reading it. Her heart leapt into her throat as she reached the page with Owen's face on it. She thought she knew the man in the photo being circulated. She folded up the newspaper and went to the house of her friend, Ruby Ogletree. When she was inside, she opened the paper to the page with his face on it and handed it to Ruby. Ruby's heart also sank. She called the KCPD with a very heavy heart, hoping that she was incorrect in her identification. She described to them her son. He had a headscar and a portion of hair that would no longer grow because hot grease had spilled there as a child. Unfortunately, Ruby would be correct. Roland T. Owens was her son, Artemis Ogletree. Artemis had taken off a year previous to hitchhike to California, and she hadn't seen him since. What was he doing in Kansas City, Missouri? But Ruby's identification raised more questions along with her answer. She didn't understand the date of death. January 5th? That doesn't make any sense. It couldn't be correct. You see, she had been receiving correspondence from Artemis after that period of time. She showed the police his letters. One was delivered in early 1935 and was typewritten, which made her very suspicious since Artemis didn't know how to type. Perhaps he'd learned? Another letter was delivered in May, stating that he was headed to Europe, followed by a special delivery letter stating that he was now boarding his ship. When August came, there was a phone call. It wasn't Artemis, and it was from Memphis, Tennessee. It was a man claiming to have been in Cairo with Artemis and gotten into a brawl, wherein Artemis had saved his life. He said that Artemis couldn't call because he was in Cairo, and that he couldn't write because he had lost his thumb in the brawl that ensued when he had saved the caller's life, but that he had married a wealthy woman and was happy. Ruby noted that he spoke wildly and irrationally, but that he did seem to know a good deal about Artemis. She spoke to him for about half an hour on the phone. Police were given the caller's name, but it has never been made public. Police checked ship records as well as the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, but there is no record of him ever having boarded a ship or arriving in Cairo. Police continued to investigate and turned up a third hotel in Kansas City in which Ogletree had stayed, the St. Regis. At that hotel he had split the cost with a friend, but all attempts to locate him or to discover a name associated with him have been in vain. Was he the mysterious Don? In 1937, a man by the name of Joseph Martin was arrested after discovering that he had murdered a man he'd shared a hotel room with and stuffed his body into a trunk to be shipped to Memphis, Tennessee. One of his aliases was Donald Kelso. At least one source claims that the police had taken note that some of the handwriting in the letters to Ruby Ogletree looked similar to that of Martin, but nothing more came of that lead. It is interesting that Ruby had received calls from Memphis, Tennessee, where he had been sending the body of the man he had killed, and that Donald was one of his aliases. But no charges were filed and the case went cold. In the early 2000s, John Horner, who was a local historian at the Kansas City Public Library, received a phone call from out of state from a man who claimed to have been going through a deceased elderly man's belongings, and he came across a box of clippings about the Roland T. Owen case. But of interest was one of the items mentioned in the newspaper that was apparently kept with the clippings. In keeping with the bizarre nature of the rest of this story, the caller did not identify himself or the item he had run across, and Horner never met with him. He made this interaction public in 2012 at the end of a blog post about the case. What happened to Artemus Ogletree? Who was Don? What had he been doing in Kansas City? Why was he so nervous about being seen? Who paid for his funeral? Who wrote the letters to Ruby Ogletree? The answers to these questions don't seem as though they will ever see the light of day. Though this case had question upon question piled on it in a heap, the one that matters the most, how and why Ogletree was killed, remains unanswered. It will, perhaps, lay perpetually in that dark part of the recesses of the human experience called the unknown.